The desert air of California burned like a forge. Heat shimmered above the runway at Muroc Field, warping the horizon into liquid metal. A silver aircraft waited at the end of the strip. Long nose, razor wings, a thing built not for beauty but for speed. The mechanics called it the Blade. Captain Jack Reynolds tightened the straps of his flight harness and stared at the numbers chalked on the fuselage, P-51H 01. The new model, lighter, sharper, faster than anything else with a propeller. Winds calm, visibility 10 miles, called the tower. Try not to set the desert on fire this time. Jack grinned behind his oxygen mask. No promises. He'd flown 26 combat sorties in Europe before they pulled him out and sent him here. They said his reflexes were too good to waste on dogfights. He hated that compliment. It sounded like retirement. Engine start. The Merlin engine coughed, then roared, a deep mechanical heartbeat that made the ground vibrate. The propeller blurred into a spinning disk, the desert wind cutting through the open cockpit. Ready for takeoff, Jack said. Cleared for run, 09 left. Godspeed, Captain. He pushed the throttle forward. The P-51 rolled, wheels rumbling over concrete faster and faster until they left the ground with a kick that felt like freedom. The desert fell away. The sky opened. At 12,000 feet, Jack pulled back the throttle and leveled off. The air here was thin and cold, the sun white. He nudged the nose higher. Blade 1, we're reading you. How's she feel? Crackled the radio. He smiled. Like she wants to leave me behind. Across an ocean and a world away, the same day was bleeding out over Saxony. In a hangar outside Bremen, the air stank of gasoline and desperation. Men moved like shadows under dim yellow bulbs. Engines growled on test stands. A single Focke-Wulf 190D sat at the center, its sleek frame half-painted, the black cross still wet. Erich Neumann wiped grease from his hands and stared at the machine. He was 37 and already older than his war. Speed, Herr Neumann, barked the officer behind him. That's what we need. Speed wins battles. The Führer himself will get what the metal allows, Erich said quietly, and not a kilometer more. The officer glared but said nothing. Erich ran a hand along the aircraft's side, feeling the heat from the newly bolted Jumo engine. He loved this thing, not as a weapon but as an idea, a line of perfection in a world coming apart. Tomorrow we test, he said to the team. Someone muttered, if there's still a tomorrow. Outside, the sound of bombers rumbled. The sky flickered red over the city. Back over the Pacific coast, Jack Reynolds climbed higher. 20,000 feet. The airspeed indicator trembled at 440. He could feel the pressure through the stick, the plane wanting more. He pushed the throttle again. The horizon began to bend. Blade 1, you're redlining, came the warning. Copy that, he smiled. Red's just a suggestion. The nose dipped slightly as he trimmed out the elevator. The altimeter ticked down. The needle on the airspeed dial slid past 460, then 470. The aircraft shuddered, wings flexing, a sound like cloth tearing through the air. He felt the onset of compressibility. The invisible wall of drag that lived just below the speed of sound. For a heartbeat, the controls froze. He should have backed off. Every instructor, every manual, every piece of training in his bones told him to ease out. Instead, he pushed harder. The P-51 screamed, a sound so high it went silent. The sky turned white. Then suddenly stillness. The pressure vanished. The plane leveled itself like slipping through a veil. The instruments blurred, time stretched thin. He heard only his own breath, the slow mechanical rhythm of a heart that didn't belong to him anymore. For a second, he thought he'd found the edge of flight itself. Then the engine coughed. At the same hour in Germany, Erich Neumann stood on the airstrip, coat collar turned against the wind. The test pilot, A young man named Klaus Ritter taxied the prototype onto the runway. The Jumo engine roared. Flames spat from the exhausts, painting the air orange. Erich raised his hand. Klaus saluted once, then pushed the throttle forward. The plane shot down the strip, wheels up before the halfway mark. It climbed like a bullet. Erich's chest swelled despite everything. The sound of the engine was music, the pure note of design made real. But then it faltered. A cough, a sputter, a change in tone only a man who'd lived with engines could hear. He turned to the officer beside him. "He's climbing too steep," the officer sneered. "He's showing what German will can do." "No," Erich whispered. "He's showing what gravity remembers." A streak of black smoke carved across the sky. The Focke-Wulf shuddered, banked hard, and vanished behind the tree line in a burst of flame. Erich didn't move. The officer did, shouting orders, summoning trucks, pretending that command still meant control. Erich only watched the smoke drift east. He could almost feel the moment the world had decided to move faster than the men who tried to own it. Jack Reynolds fought the stall. The Merlin sputtered once more, then caught again. He eased the throttle back, heart pounding. "Blade 1, report." He laughed breathlessly into the radio. "Still here. Still flying." "Speed readout?" He checked the dial. The needle had spun past the numbers, bent against the stop. He tapped it. Nothing. "Fast enough," he said. He banked toward the desert. The sun hung low, red and fat over the horizon. Below, the salt flats looked like frozen fire. As he descended, he realized he couldn't feel his hands. The edges of the world blurred. Everything, sound, speed, fear, fused into one long hum. He thought of the men still fighting in Europe, of the names printed in black on bulletin boards at air bases, of how every one of them had chased something: victory, redemption, speed. When his wheels touched the runway, he didn't cheer. He just sat there, engine idling, watching the heat rise from the wings like smoke from an altar. That night, both men, one in California, one in Germany, but stood alone, staring at the machines that had almost killed them or their brothers. In different languages, they whispered the same thing. "If we can go faster, maybe we can leave this war behind." The runway lights at Muroc looked like a necklace laid across the desert, beads of sodium yellow glinting in heat shiver. Jack Reynolds stood at the edge of the flight line with his helmet under his arm and listened to the night. The desert had a way of going quiet that wasn't quiet at all. Crickets stitching the dark, a distant generator coughing, the slow clink of a cooling engine dropping back into itself. Somewhere beyond the hangars, a coyote laughed like a broken radio. "Tomorrow we take her higher," the crew chief said, thumb hooked toward the P-51H gleaming under a tarp. "If you plan on bringing her back in one piece, try not to peel the wings off." "I'll bring her back," Jack said. He didn't add what sat behind his teeth. "Or I won't bring me back." Sleep came in slices. He woke before dawn to a sky the color of raw aluminum and strapped into the cockpit while the sun burned up over the mountains. The Merlin lit with a cough that turned into a roar. He rolled down the strip and climbed into a cold blue so clean it looked new. At 28,000 feet, he trimmed nose down into a shallow dive and felt the first tremors of compressibility. Buffet skating along the tail, a whisper turning into a growl as the airflow decided it had other places to be. He eased the trim tab and rode the shaking, the needle pushing past what the manual pretended was the edge. The world narrowed to a quiver in his hands and a thin line on the horizon that promised he still had somewhere to go. Back on the ground, the engineers argued in grease and chalk. "Flutter at 0.78, one said, tapping a blackboard covered in curves. "Elevator hinge moments skyrocket. If he keeps pushing, the tail will let go." Jack drank coffee that had been brave too long and stared at the chalk marks like they were weather. "Then give me more tab." If the tail won't hold, I'll do it for her. The chief rubbed his face. You're not supposed to win an argument with air. Then don't make it an argument. In England, dawn arrived as a smear of pewter across the channel, rain trying to remember how to be snow. Squadron leader Arthur Finch dragged a sleeve across his canopy and watched a V1 pulse toward London like a wicked heartbeat. The Spitfire Maho Fantôme with its Griffon engine had teeth the old Merlins didn't. He eased the throttle until the nose sang, slid alongside the buzz bomb, and tipped a wing under the robot's fin as gently as a waiter righting a bottle. The V1 wobbled, lost its gyros, fell away toward the empty fields of Kent. He watched it go with the same careful lack of interest he gave his own breath. The tally chalked on the board back at Ford was already a list he no longer looked at. "Nice nudge, Finch," Control said in his ear. "T when you're back. Make it strong." On landing, a young pilot with a dog-eared manual under his arm jogged beside the wing. "Sir, they say you pushed .82 in the dive yesterday. Is that—" "Numbers are for the dead," Finch said mildly, then softened it with a smile that put the man back on his heels. "What matters is what the wings tell you before the dial does." He walked the line, listened to the engines cooling, and thought of the rumor that had hummed through the mess 2 nights ago. An American down at Boscombe with a new Mustang, claiming he'd kiss the wall and come back with his lips. Finch had no patience for boast, but he had time for men who learned from speed without worshipping it. The war had taught him the difference. It was the distance between a pilot and a meteor. In Bremen, the factory siren didn't bother trying to be a song anymore. It wailed the way metal does when it remembers it is ore. Erich Neumann stood under a dingy skylight while fresh glass dusted the floor like a new kind of snow. A telegram sat open on his bench. Berlin screaming for miracles in the language of requisition forms. He read it, folded it back along its worn creases, and slid it under a tray of rivets. "You heard about Ritter," Dieter said quietly, eyes not leaving the bracket he was filing. Erich nodded once. "There will be a street named for him in a town that doesn't exist by winter. Will we test again?" "We must." He rested his palms on the wing root of the new Dora, metal still warm from a run-up. "Speed is the only prayer they still allow." Dieter blew metal dust from his lip. "And what do you pray for?" "For the wind, to be honest." They scrounged a new pilot from a squadron that had run out of planes before it ran out of men. They fitted a deeper radiator fairing, one more cheat against drag, and polished the wing's leading edge until it reflected their faces as curved ghosts. At dusk, they wheeled the aircraft into the open to a soundtrack of distant guns and closer promises. It thundered down the track and leaped into a bruised sky, and Erich stood with his hands on nothing and felt old. The second test didn't end with a fireball. It ended with a radio crackle and an engine that came back down trailing oil like a ritual. They pulled the cowling at midnight, faces lit strange by acetylene, and found a seal that had decided the war was no longer its business. Erich laughed, short, wrong. It is always the small thing that decides the large thing. At Muroc, Jack sat through a briefing run by a man who loved rules because he lacked rhythm. "Do not exceed 30 degrees in the dive," the man said, pointer clicking on a graph. "Do not exceed .75 Mach at 25,000 feet. Do not—" "Make promises to air," Jack said under his breath, and the test crew around him tried not to cough a laugh. Orders came anyway. "You're going to England." The Pacific was eating men 300 at a time and still found room for more, but Europe's sky had a few last things to say before it went quiet. He ferried the Mustang across by way of Greenland and Iceland, salt spray trying climb the fuselage at every takeoff. Cold living in his bones like a second spine. In a dim dispersal hut at Boscombe, he met a lean man with a quiet face and rain on his coat who said, "Finch," and shook his hand like a colleague rather than an opponent. "You're the American who thinks numbers are a suggestion," Finch said. "You're the Brit who treats bombs like tableware," Jack said. They smiled with the sort of amusement only tired men get right. In the morning, they rolled out a Griffon Spit and the P-51H side by side, two ways of drawing a line through the sky. Engineers circled, pencils behind ears, speaking a common dialect of swear and prayer. "What's the plan?" Finch asked. "Climb over the Irish Sea, use a dead calm lane the weather boys swear they can hold for half an hour. Run a shallow dive from 30 to 20 with trim bias in and tabs at 3 degrees, Jack said as if reciting a recipe. "We chase a balloon the Met Office will let go at 0950. First to match and overtake in level flight near .85 buys the other a whiskey." "Make it 2, Finch said, "in case one of us is slower than our pride." They went up into a sky scrubbed clean by wind. The weather balloon rose ahead, a fat white pearl clawing after the sun. At 28,000 feet, the air took the color out of everything. Jack set the nose down 2 degrees, eased throttle to the stop, felt the slight give as the Mustang's soul flowed forward. The needle slid. 74, 76. Tail buffeting arrived like a memory. He dialed trim with fingers that had learned to write in that language. The stick went heavy, then light. The horizon stiffened as if bracing. Beside him and a little high, Finch's Spitfire became a silver arrow. .78, Finch said, voice level. "How's your tail?" "Humming. Mine's singing bass." "Push," Jack said. They did together as if the sky would be more likely to forgive 2 men than 1. The balloon hung to the right like an indifferent moon. 80, the buffeting shook hard enough to blur the world. Jack felt the elevator try to snatch the stick from his hand. He pushed trim a breath farther and the Mustang smoothed, only slightly, only enough for breath to forget it owed fear. He slid past the balloon with a small, obscene grace. 82, Finch said. His voice had an edge that wasn't fear. It was respect. "You slippery bastard." They leveled at 22,000 and let the air come back to them the way a crowd settles after an ovation. On the way down, Finch said, "You know you're going to get men killed with that trick. I know not teaching it will get more." Finch didn't answer for a while. When he did, it was to say, "There's a pub in Boscombe with a picture of a kite that flew too close to the sun. They hung it there after a prototype shed its tail. We drink under it to remember the bargain." "What's the bargain?" Jack asked. "That nothing worth doing with wings is safe." Over Germany, speed became a battlefield no one could afford to lose and no one could afford to win. Erich watched boys taxi out in machines whose curves he had helped draw and wondered what sentence he was writing with their lives. Orders landed like shells. Prepare the Ta-152 for altitude tests. Move facilities east. Burn anything the Russians can use. Keep your engineers until the last minute. He smuggled Dieter's younger brother onto a transport with a crate of jigs and lied to a major who had learned to tell the truth only to power. One night, after sirens and a run to the shelter and back, he found a letter on his bench. It was from the Ritter family. The words were clean. "Thank you for telling us he did not suffer. We know it is not true, but we also know that you wish it were. His mother still sets a place." Erich stood very still while the factory continued to sound like a dying animal around him, and felt something in his chest step to the side to make room for the letter. In England, the whiskey tasted like wood smoke. Jack and Finch sat with their backs to a wall that had learned to hold up men and time in roughly equal measure. The pub smelled of wet wool and stories that had been told too often to be called lies. On the wireless, a voice spoke about fronts moving, cities liberated, the end beginning to look like an end instead of a rumor. "What will you do when it's over?" Finch asked. "Find a sky that doesn't need me to be faster than someone else." "You think there is one? I think we'll have to teach one." Outside, rain made the cobbles shine like varnished bone. A waif passed with a bundle of laundry and a laugh she couldn't quite keep to herself. Somewhere a siren wound half-heartedly and stopped. The habit outlived the reason. Orders found Jack again, a demonstration flight for the brass over the North Sea. Proof that the new propeller fighters could sit just below the wall and live there. A last war lecture before the jet age arrived and changed the subject. Finch would fly right, Jack left, a pair of lines drawn fast enough to be believed. In a pocket of gray air between storms, they would show speed turning into steadiness instead of death. Far away, in a hangar with a roof like a tired shoulder, Erich rolled the Ta-152 into the light with the help of men whose hands were older than their faces. The aircraft looked like a yes held in the throat for too long. He signed a paper that made it legal to risk a life he did not own. The pilot climbed the ladder and paused with a hand on the canopy rail. "Will it be fast enough?" Erich touched the wing the way a man touches a forehead to check for fever. "It will be what it can be. The rest is wind." He stepped back, wiped his palms on a rag that had forgotten what clean meant, and listened to the Dora's long cousin clear its throat. The propeller bit the air. The future came on like weather. Above two different coasts, three men leaned into the same invisible wall, and the war leaned back. The spring of 1945 came without color. Snow melted into mud, cities into ghosts. The maps on briefing room walls were less geography now than tally marks of exhaustion. At Boscombe Down, they painted the nose of Jack Reynolds's P-51H white for the demonstration flight. A symbol of peace, someone said, though to Jack it looked more like a flag you fly when you've run out of answers. The engineers had polished the cowling until the sunlight hurt. Finch stood beside the aircraft, gloved hands in his pockets, watching the last of the crew step away. "Wind steady out of the southwest," Finch said. "If we climb through it, we'll see the channel clear by the time the fog lifts." Jack adjusted his goggles. "They want us to make it look easy. Everything worth doing looks easy from the ground." They shook hands. No grand speeches. Men who had talked to death too often had learned not to make introductions on the way to meet him again. Erich Neumann spent that same morning packing the blueprints he'd promised himself he would never finish. The sound of boots on concrete outside told him the Soviets were close. "Sir," Dieter said, standing by the door, rifle slung awkwardly over one shoulder. "The officers say to burn it all." "I built these lines," Erich said. "I'll decide what fire they find." He gathered the rolls of tracing paper, drawings of wing routes and cooling ducts, and laid them on the floor in a neat square. He struck a match. For a moment the room filled with the smell of varnish and promise. The flames curled along the edges of the paper, making the wings fly one last time in orange light. When the soldiers entered, all they found was a man staring at smoke and a single intact drawing left folded on the bench. A planform of a wing thinner than air had any right to allow. "Comrade, you will come with us," said the officer. Erich nodded, eyes still on the last ember. "You're late," he said quietly. "It's already gone." Over the North Sea, the sky was the color of tin. Two aircraft, one silver, one gray-green, climbed in wide arcs toward 30,000 feet. The ground below was a quilt of thawing snow and bomb scars. "Control to lead. You are clear to begin," the radio said. Jack took a breath. "Roger that. Commencing dive." The Mustang tipped its nose forward. The Spitfire followed a half-length behind. The air tore past the canopies like sandpaper. Instruments blurred. At .81 Mach, the vibrations started, a deep pulse that crawled up through the stick into Jack's hands. "Finch? Still with you. Let's see how close the wall wants to dance today." They leveled at 22,000 feet, throttle full forward. The engines bellowed, a duet of pistons trying to outrun their own echoes. Ahead, the sea shimmered. Behind, vapor trails twisted like chalk lines drawn by someone too tired to keep them straight. Finch's voice cracked through the static. "If this is the last flight of the prop age, it's a fine way to say goodbye." Jack didn't answer. The airspeed needle trembled near the red. The world outside seemed to stretch. For one long, impossible moment, the two aircraft flew in perfect parallel, shadows touching across the sunlight. Then the sky buckled. A downdraft rolled off the cold front ahead, invisible, sudden. Finch's Spitfire dropped half a wing and yawed hard left. The stress line that engineers warned about, the one between speed and survival, found him before he found it. Jack saw the Spitfire twist, saw the flash of sunlight on a canopy turning over, and dove after it. "Finch, pull up." Static. Then a laugh, thin and oddly calm. "Tell them we did it, Jack. Tell them we broke the sky." The Spitfire disappeared into the mist. The sound reached him a heartbeat later, one sharp crack, then nothing. They found the wreckage 3 days later on a Dutch beach, half buried in sand. The locals marked the spot with driftwood and waited for someone to care. The war ended that week. Jack stood beside the Mustang on the same airfield and stared at the empty sky. Reporters wanted statements. Officers wanted figures. He gave them neither. When the last camera turned away, he took off one final time, climbing until the ground was only color. At 20,000 feet, he cut the throttle, let the engine idle, and listened to the air. It had changed. There was something quieter in it now, something almost kind. He thought of Finch's words, of Erich Neumann's machines, of every pilot who had mistaken speed for salvation. Then he banked east, toward the rising sun, until the light swallowed everything. In a camp outside Dresden, Erich worked under guard, designing engines for the men who had captured him. The guards didn't know that in the quiet hours he rewrote his equations, slower, simpler. Machines meant for peace. One night a parcel arrived with no sender. A photo of a Spitfire's wingtip recovered from Holland, and a note in English. "To the man who made the wind honest. We learned from you. A friend." He held the picture under the lamp for a long time, then set it beside the drawing he had refused to burn. Years later, a new age began. Swept wings, jet thunder, contrails higher than weather. The names changed, but sometimes in the hum between radio frequencies, flight test crews swore they heard a voice cut through the static. Calm, steady American vowels wrapped in English composure. "Ease the trim. She'll hold." No one could trace it. They said it came from the old range over the Irish Sea, or maybe from nowhere at all. But the test pilots who heard it always looked up and smiled before pushing the throttle forward, as if answering an invitation that had been waiting in the air since the war ended. And high above the world, where the sky thins into silence, the echo of that race still lingers. Two contrails running side by side, fading into the light.